Reagan's critics said that SDI was hugely expensive and would never work. They were appalled by the deep cuts in welfare programs that would be needed to pay for it. Ronald Reagan soon discovered that his close ally, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was also critical of SDI. A firm believer in the nuclear deterrent, she tried to persuade her friend to abandon his beloved Star Wars.
Staff around the table afterwards said that Reagan had really gotten handbagged that day, and he called me to the Oval Office the next morning and he said, Bud, Margaret and we are just not getting along on this SDI issue. I wish you'd go to London and see if you can't at least lower the level of criticism publicly. We're going to have a tough time getting appropriations if this keeps up. She gave me the same lecture she'd given 2 weeks before, and seeing I was getting nowhere, I interjected during a pause. Prime Minister President Reagan believes that there's at least $300 million a year that ought to be subcontracted to British companies that would support SDI. And there was a long pause. She finally said, there may be something to this after all.
Leonid Brezhnev died in November 1982. The ailing KGB chief, Yuri Andropov, succeeded him. Andropov was frightened by SDI and Reagan's anti-Soviet speeches. Convinced that the West was plotting war, Andropov ordered a worldwide alert. The KGB monitored every aspect of life in the West.
The banking system was to be closely watched, as were the hospitals and road-building programs. Were the banks attempting to convert their system to a war footing? Were hospitals preparing new beds and setting up blood banks for massive numbers of wounded?
The Americans stepped up spy flights in sensitive areas along the Soviet Union's long borders. Aircraft packed with electronic surveillance gear looked like civilian airliners and often flew close to passenger routes.
In this period, 81, 82, and especially 83, how did it feel on the front line? Well, we were flying more often as there were more spy planes provoking us. We were in a constant state of tension.
On August 31st, 1983, a South Korean airliner, KAL Flight 007, with 269 people on board, left Anchorage for Seoul. The Boeing 747 strayed from its normal route into Soviet airspace.
I received a phone call informing me that an unidentified plane had been spotted over Kamchatka and that our attempts to contact it had been unsuccessful. I ensured that all the forces at our disposal were immediately put on alert. I said, take all measures, so that it is either forced to land on Sakhalin, or, if it will not cooperate, shoot it down.
I could see 2 rows of windows which were lit up. I wondered if it was a civilian aircraft. Military cargo planes don't have such windows. I wondered what kind of plane it was, but I had no time to think. I had a job to do. I started to signal to him in international code. I informed him that he'd violated our airspace. He did not respond.
Despite the signals from our planes, including warning shots with tracers, the pilot failed to react, simply continuing on his course.
My orders were to destroy the intruder. I fulfilled my mission.
The Korean airliner came down off Sakhalin Island, killing everyone on board.
The United States reacts with revulsion to this attack. Loss of life appears to be heavy. We can see no excuse whatsoever for this appalling act.
We came to the conclusion that we simply needed to be honest and admit an unfortunate incident has occurred. There was a pilot error, bad weather. One thing led to another. It was not a pre-planned action. No one wanted this. It was a tragic mistake. We went to Kornienko, the deputy foreign minister, who agreed with us. But he was not able to convince the leadership. This was a question of prestige, and the military don't like to admit mistakes.
A mood of crisis now gripped both East and West. Arms control talks were broken off. Soviet SS-20 rockets were now confronted by cruise and Pershing missiles deployed in Western Europe. The Soviet leadership believed a nuclear attack by the West was imminent. A British agent inside the KGB sent warnings to London.
When I told the British, they simply couldn't believe that the Soviet leadership was so stupid and narrow-minded as to believe in something so impossible. I said to them, okay, I'll get you the documents.
I think only a tiny handful of people knew the full details of how fearful they were, and we knew them, as is now public knowledge, through some extremely well-placed agents who were able to pass on the information that the Russians actually feared that the West was preparing for aggressive nuclear war against the Soviet Union.
Allied and domestic concern rose.
Good evening. Please be seated.
Reagan tried to reassure Andropov.
Just suppose with me for a moment that an Ivan and an Anya could find themselves, say, in a waiting room or sharing a shelter from the rain or a storm with a Jim and Sally. And there was no language barrier to keep them from getting acquainted. Would they then debate the differences between their respective governments? Or would they find themselves comparing notes about their children and what each other did for a living?
Ronald Reagan, encouraged by his wife Nancy, consulted Suzanne Massey, a popular writer on Russia, to help him understand his Cold War adversary.
President Reagan was, of course, a people person. He loved people, and he had great instinct for people. I had been told by these fellows at the White House that, of course, if I were ever writing anything for the president, it had to be double-spaced 1.5 pages. Well, what can you get from that? President Reagan had never seen a Russian in the first 3 years. He couldn't go there. He was an actor. Actors like to absorb from feeling. I said, Mr. President, if you are re-elected, will this policy of small steps toward better relations be a continuing policy of your administration? And Ronald Reagan had a pretty eagle eye when he wanted to, and he looked down at me and he said, very definitely, he said, yes, if they want peace, they can have it.
But to whom in the Kremlin could Reagan talk peace? In March 1984, Yuri Andropov died. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was too frail to start a dialogue. The West looked for some small sign of change.
We needed to try to search out the people who would guide the Soviet Union after Brezhnev, after Andropov. And looking around, there were about 2 or 3 possible people in terms of age and seniority. We dispatched invitations to all 3. It was pure chance that Gorbachev was the one who accepted first. When Gorbachev came to the United Kingdom, he indeed brought his wife, and that was one of the first signs that we were dealing with someone quite different. Soviet leaders very, very rarely traveled with their wives anywhere.
There were you guys down there.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We both believe in our own political systems. He firmly believes in his, I firmly believe in mine. We're never going to change one another.
We better hang on from them.
Еще какие пожелания?